Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm usually your host, Ann Snyder, but today you're going to get a nice reprieve from my overly trapezing brain to sit at the feet of my perceptive and more disciplined colleague, Heidi Deddens, who is one of Comment's trusted editors. Please do enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Whole Person Revolution. My name is Heidi Deddens, and I'm an associate editor at Comment Magazine, where this season we're exploring all things friendship. What is it? Why is it in decline? And how can we bring health back into the essential but often unspoken commitments that we call friendship? Today I'm talking with Joy Clarkson. Joy wears many hats. She's the books and culture editor for our friends over at Plough Quarterly, and she recently graduated with a PhD in theology from the University of St. Andrews, where she studied death, art, and affect. She hosts her own podcast called Speaking with Joy, where she celebrates the true, the good, and the beautiful in art and elsewhere. She's also the author of multiple books, most recently Aggressively Happy, a book about cultivating joy in the midst of turmoil. And a few years ago, she co-authored a book on friendship called Girls Club, Cultivating Lasting Friendship in a Lonely World, written with her mother, Sally Clarkson, and her sister, Sarah Clarkson. In all these efforts, she offers her readers and listeners practical wisdom and hard-won hope, both of which come through in the way she engages with people online. And last but not least, she is a friend to many people around the globe. Joy, welcome to the podcast.
I am so happy to be with you, Heidi. I've been looking forward to this.
I want to kick things off with a question that when we were first talking about this issue as editors, we thought, oh, this is a fairly basic question. But then the more that we talked about it, we realized kind of how thorny of a question it is. So I want to know how you would define friendship.
I'm not sure I have a very, very precise definition, but I think I would say that it's a relationship of mutual investment that doesn't have any legal or familial ties, and that is for the betterment of the other person. The thing that's interesting about friendship is we often speak about our family members or our partners as being our friends. And I think there's something beautiful and good about that. Essentially, one of the unique things about friendship is that it's something that we choose and choose for the mutual betterment of another person. It's not something that is kind of a necessary part of our duties or our relationships in the world. I've lived all over the world, and I've thought about how everywhere that I've gone, I've developed friends. But it's this really strange thing because developing a friendship is often kind of picking a person and being like, would you like to spend time with me? And then somewhere down the road, bring me soup when I'm ill. And so it's this sense of mutual investment that's done freely and without the obligations that are associated with family or vocation.
I really love that you highlight the word mutual, because when we were asking people to define friendship, that word came up so many times again and again, mutual or shared. And I do think that's a really key aspect of friendship. I know you had a fairly nomadic childhood, and you've also now moved across the Atlantic. And I'm curious how that aspect of your life has shaped your understanding of friendship.
To fill in a few of the grains on that picture you painted, my family, as my mother loves to recite, moved 19 times and 6 times internationally. So my parents were missionaries when they first got married, and then moved for various things, for publishing, for churches and stuff. So I grew up primarily between Texas, Tennessee, and Colorado. And then as an adult, I went to school out of state. So I went to California, and then I chose to study overseas, where I've been in Scotland, mostly at St. Andrews University, or the University of St. Andrews, and then at Oxford. And so I've had an experience of a kind of, in some ways, uprooted life. And I think that a lot of what is explored in publications like Comment and like Plough is a desire to kind of recover or begin a sense of rootedness. And I think what impresses me about those many moves is that to the extent that I've had rootedness in my life, it has been because of the longevity of my friendships. That there are friendships that have stretched across those years and across those miles, and that it's actually the relationships itself that's provided rootedness, and kind of being willing to till that soil, even when the soil of my actual life might have been in a different continent that I was expecting. And I think also it's made me realize how essential friendship is. I think because of the nature of kind of my parents growing up, and when I grew up, we weren't near family. And so, whenever we would have holidays or things like that, if we were going to have them, we were going to have them not with blood relatives, but with friends. And I think for me, I felt that friendship was something that was quite essential. Like, it's not just kind of like an add-on to if you have the blessing of a huge, extended family. It's something that you need. It's the foundation of moving to a new place, both in the sense that we have a profound, I think, spiritual and social need for it, but also in the sense of when you move to a new country, one of the first things you need is somebody who will come alongside you and tell you how to shop at the grocery store, or, where to find that American ingredient that you're dying to have. So I think those are some of the things. Friendship for me has been a form of rootedness, and it's something absolutely essential, both in a survival way and in a spiritual flourishing way.
That's one of the reasons why we wanted to explore this as editors. When we first started talking about the idea, we thought, oh, is this kind of basic? Like, maybe it's too simple. Friendship it's everywhere. Everyone has friends. And then the more that we started digging into it, the more we realized, actually, it's not so simple, and not everyone has friends, or not to the extent that they would like, maybe not to the depth that they would like. And there's a bunch of research that has been done that shows increasing social isolation even before COVID happened. And a lot of people saying things about their friendships like, oh, I have very few close friends, or maybe no close friends, only sort of acquaintance friends, and really expressing like a hunger and a longing for that. And even among Christian circles, where we think of the church community as providing sort of a built-in method of being able to access friendship, there's still a lot of loneliness and a lot of hunger for that. So I'd love to ask you a very practical question, which we've had some readers ask us, which is just simply, how do you make friends and how do you maintain friends? And I think especially, like, as you said, our generation is somewhat rootless. So for people who have moved around a lot and who feel the grief of having friends who are far away from them, how do you maintain those friendships in particular?
When I think of making friends, I think of being in a new place. And I think a lot of it is just being willing to be an initiator. I think there are a lot of parallels between dating and friend making, in the sense that you kind of have to be willing to, when you meet somebody at a church potluck or at a work event, and you think we have something in common, be willing to be the pushy one and say, I'd really like to get together. Let's get lunch. But then equally, another side of that is being willing to know that not everyone is going to be your friend. Not everyone's going to be the perfect clique. And so if you get lunch with somebody one time and they're not your BFF, neither feel guilty nor feel obligated to try to, we should be kind to everyone, but you don't have to make every friendship the panacea. And so some of that kind of willingness to be pushy, and then the emotional resilience that goes with that. Often my best friendships have been not kind of out of this just reaching across the desert of loneliness and saying, will you meet my emotional needs, but doing something together. Lewis has that famous quote in The Four Loves where he says, lovers look at each other, but friends look forward at the same thing. They're going in the same direction. And so when I think now some of my best friends, a lot of us we were formed around doing similar things. And sometimes that was in a profound way, and sometimes it's not in a profound way. So, several of my dearest friends, from the last few years, I made while I was doing my master's. But I think that sharing that experience of being overseas, we are all Americans overseas, working our tails off together, kind of in the company of one another, and encouraging each other to do that, and giving each other tips and everything. Being the only women in a very male-dominated world, that also kind of helped bond us together. But I think those shared experiences are a really important part of making friendships, because I think that if you come to somebody and you have this infinite need for connection, and you're just like, please connect with me. There's nowhere for it to go. Do you know what I mean? Like, you need to be able to connect about something. And I think also when you have shared activities or shared purpose, it's easier to integrate people into like the rhythm of your life. Because for me, when I feel like a friendship has developed is when I expect someone to be in the rhythm of my life. So sometimes that's working together or writing together or having a shared book club together, those, whether that's an essential activity to your profession or not. When I moved to Oxford, we we went to the same church, and we would just go and get a quick bite of dinner whenever we could every Sunday night. And our friendship is not, we're not writing a book together. We're at very different places in life. But even just that shared activity of we go to church, we go to dinner, and we talk about it. Being willing to be the initiator.
Yeah.
Also having enough humility and emotional resilience to not need every friendship to be your best friendship. And then also kind of looking for friendships that are about something other than the friendship. Because I think also when friendships are kind of just about you and me and not about the life that we're all trying to make together and, coming alongside each other, they can become quite almost ingrown or a little bit sticky or unhealthy sometimes in my experience.
Gracie Olmsted once wrote in her newsletter about doing chores with friends or doing like work around the house or big projects with friends, and how that's not only a great way to bond you, but then it turns those things where you might say, oh, I'm so busy, I don't have time to see my friends, into opportunities to get closer to one another and support each other in a really tangible way. And she wrote that one quite a while ago, but it's stuck with me ever since as like such a wise way of looking at friendships and at our time. A lot of the things that you mentioned there are tangible sort of physical activities that you can do, but for friends that are across a distance, that's not always possible. How do you maintain your friendships with people who still live in the States when you're in the UK? And how do you make sure that those friends know that they're important when you're unable to grab dinner with them or help them out with a project or those sorts of things?
Yeah, it's interesting because even having given all that advice, most of my closest friends do not live in the same city as me or country. There is like a certain level of like, once someone is initiated into the rhythm of your life, even once they're far away, they're still kind of there in the space of your mind where you just want them to be there. And so you continue to invest in them, maintaining long distance friendships. Part of it is getting over the millennial resistance to phone calls. Like I have several dear friends who we just pick up the phone and call each other and check in and see how things are going. And I love that. And I love, and kind of remembering what's happening in another person's life and kind of having that as a tab that's open in your mind, So remembering what's happening in other people's lives, checking in on it, having Skype dates, as silly as that sounds. Like, one of my friends and I will schedule a tea time and we'll both pour a cup of tea and we will sit and just catch up on things. And then being physically proximate when we can, I think, when it's possible financially and when there's not a global pandemic happening, it's great to be able to schedule things like once a year to be able to be with each other. And then I think just, again, remembering what's happening, big moments in other people's lives, and sending them a card or sending a care package when you know things are difficult. I think there's many ways of keeping someone present in your mind, even, and your sense of what's happening in the world, even when they're not physically proximate, and showing that you remember, that you care, and that you want to know what's happening in their life.
One of the things that I'm really interested in is embodiment. And I know from having read Aggressively Happy that you also celebrate embodiment. So I'm curious just what your thoughts are on the intersection of embodiment and long distance friendship. We recognize that we are embodied creatures and that that's essential to who we are as people. But for long stretches of our long distance friendships, that aspect has to be sort of taken away. Our communication happens over Skype or text or email or phone or all these different sort of technologically mediated ways.
I think that's one of the most painful things about long distance friendships is that, one of the great gifts of a friend is when you're feeling down, you want someone to wrap their arms around you and give you a hug, or you want someone to bring you soup. You want something that tastes and feels and sounds like love. Maybe even part of being embodied is that we are limited. And so we experience missing someone. That actually is a part of being an embodied creature, is that we can't always be in the same place. And that increases our sense of desire and our experience of joy when we are reunited. And that maybe that's not a bad thing. We don't cease to be embodied because our relationship is not proximate. We are embodied and separated, and that actually creates missing and affection in a different way. But I also think that goes down to the kind of practical things like remembering to send a care package, in that's this kind of strange magic of, I am in a different place, but I want to send you something that you can touch and smell and see as a reminder that I love you. And, and I remember a really hard time for me was I had someone very dear to me and close to me have a miscarriage. She was far away. And that's just it was like a doubly sad thing, because it's a grief over someone that I have never touched from someone that I love dearly that's far away. But I think being able to do something as simple as, I guess one of the nice things about living in a world with technology is that we can actually send someone a meal through Deliveroo or Uber Eats. And I know that seems like a silly thing, but I think that's a way to maintain that sense of, I may be far away, but I want to be proximate in this way. Being able to actually see somebody again in real life and looking forward to that and making that a priority, If there's someone to whom you are really tied and you have a deep and loyal friendship, make it a priority of time and of money to be able to see them. I used to read Poirot novels, and I would think like, who are all these people in the 20s who would go on these 2-week vacations? And I know that's not always possible, but I think that actually with all the travel restrictions and how expensive it is, and I've actually gotten to be where I'm like, no, if I'm going to see a friend and it's possible for both of our schedules, really lean into it and embrace it and celebrate those times when you can be together, and don't be stingy about it. So those are all kind of some of the ways that I am friends and have a body.
I'm curious if you've ever had friendships end due to distance, and if you have any advice for people on how to manage the end of a friendship gracefully. I think for lots of our other relationships, particularly for dating relationships, there's sort of a script that people know to follow. But with friendships, there's no scripts around these things. The currents of those friendships are sort of unspoken, and so then the ends of the friendship often feel like they lack closure for people when that situation happens. So I'm curious if you've experienced that and what advice you would have for people.
I definitely have had friendships kind of fade. Part of the reason that we have a script for when a dating relationship ends is that a dating relationship is it has a telos, which is you either marry the person you date or you don't. And so I think there's a sense that even if you, that relationship, dating relationships always end, actually, when you think about it. They always end because they always either become marriage or they go back to friendship or they mean the end of the relationship. Whereas I think with friendship, it's a little bit less clear, right? Friendship isn't for, we might say in some of my friendships, friendship is for godparenthood, that you are friends until you are your friends' godparents, the godparents of their children. But, there's less of a clear end to friendships. And in that sense, you never kind of have to end a friendship, in the same way that you would have to end a dating relationship. I think that one thing I would say is I have had friendships end, but usually not because of long distance. And when it comes to long distance, I think something that I've been thinking about lately is being willing to let relationships and friendships evolve, and know that maybe this relationship will evolve in such a way that we won't be as in touch as we used to be, or people get married and they have kids and they are less able to be invested in regular conversation, but there's still a sense of affection and care. And so I think in those instances, if you're feeling kind of a sadness or like someone's growing away from you, evaluate in yourself, is this something that this is a relationship where I'm close enough that I want to express, I'm feeling a little bit hurt because you seem to be pulling away from me. Evaluate, is that what I need to do? Or do I need to say, maybe this is changing, not because they're pulling away from me, but just because it's a different season of life. And in both of those instances, I think it's good to communicate. So if you are wanting to be more intentional about keeping up the friendship at a distance and you feel like they also did and that you feel like they're pulling away, then just say, I really value our friendship and I would love to talk about how we can keep up, not in a way that's pressured, but just I want to stay involved in your life and I want to support you as a friend. And if on the other hand, you evaluate and you go, I think it makes sense, this is just kind of changing, it's not a rejection of me, but it's just where it is. Then I think the other way is just to say, I know it's been less easy for us to be in touch, but I really care about you. I'm excited about your life. And if you ever want to talk, if you ever want to visit, I'm here. And I think that can be a good way of just kind of never feeling like you've left something unsaid, and not letting bitterness or sadness grow in your own heart. But also letting friendships grow and change. I have friends who I've gotten back in touch with after periods of great kind of distance. And if I had been really angry or sad in the moments when we kind of didn't, then maybe we wouldn't have had the freedom to be able to kind of return to each other once life was slightly different. So I think being willing for relationships to evolve, and then communicating, I care about you. I'm excited about your life, and I'm always here to talk and to be as invested as you want to be. And kind of doing that self-awareness work, I think is helpful. So that no one feels guilty. Because I think that's the thing about a friendship. A friendship is a purposeful investment in someone's life who actually in a way doesn't directly affect yours. They're not going to give you money necessarily. They're not going to bear your children. So leaving that kind of openness, but expressing that desire to stay connected, I think is a really joyful and generous way to stay connected without bearing those burdens of hurt.
It's interesting to hear you talk about sort of that posture of generosity and letting other people have their freedom within the friendship. One of our contributing editors, Elizabeth Oldfield, wrote a piece for us for this issue on friendship contracts. And she started thinking about the idea of friendship contracts because she lives in an intentional Christian community. And so her husband and her had to make a contract with their friends because they owned assets together and they were pursuing this sort of very intentional community together. So lawyers were like, you need a contract to sort all of these things out. So she started exploring friendship contracts more broadly and found online that there was sort of a hunger for them because they felt sort of a scarcity mindset maybe around their friendships, or they felt a lot of anxiety around the thought that some friendships could ebb and flow in their strength. And so they wanted to put something in place to say, no, this is firm. This is going to be here forever. You're going to be here for me and I'm going to be here for you. And I'm curious if you've ever been tempted to formalize any of your friendships, not necessarily in writing out a contract, but in saying, hey, we mean something to each other and we want to make that commitment known to each other in a more tangible way. I think the word covenant comes up a lot as well, especially for Christians who are more familiar with the idea of a covenant. The idea that you could maybe set out a covenant with your friend like David and Jonathan had and say, this is what we mean to each other and we're going to vow this. So have you ever been tempted to do that in any of your friendships?
Yeah, I suppose. I think I have been tempted in sentiment, if not in practicality. And I think it's interesting, I can think of examples of that in a funny way in my life. Like I have an adult godchild, by which I mean a friend who became a Christian when she was an adult and was baptized, and I was her sponsor. And in my mind, and I think also in hers, but particularly in mine as the person who is her sponsor, she's just a dear friend who I always will enjoy being a friend with. But I also have this sense that that's a real honor, and that I am bound to her and kind of not in a duty or an obligatory way, but also in the sense that that's something quite literally sacramental. It's something that I feel bound to her. And actually, I think in some ways, godparenthood is an interesting kind of example of that, because usually godparents are not siblings. I am a godparent to my nieces and nephews. But it's that sense of, it's kind of something you can actually do in the church to make someone who is not your blood relative, your spiritual relative, even though we are all spiritual relatives to a certain extent. So I think in that sense, I am for kind of a sense of covenant or spiritual obligation to certain people in our lives. But in a funny way, I find myself actually a little bit resistant to the idea of writing a contract, because to me, the whole notion of friendship is kind of a generous giving without obligation. And I don't mean that there's no obligations, right? Like we have the obligation of love and of truthfulness. We have many obligations like that, in the sense that you don't have an obligation to be my friend. And that, in that sense, that is kind of part of, I think, to me, what it is to be a friend is to not have that obligation. But that doesn't mean that I don't believe in having forever friends. And like, I think of my mom, and we write about this in the Girls Club, but my mom had a dear friend. They were missionaries together in Eastern Europe in the late 70s when it was still communist in Poland. And that was just a really profound and deep friendship that was going to be lifelong. And they didn't write a covenant, although they would talk about a sense of covenant friendship, that they were a bit like a David and Jonathan friendship. And I guess the way they celebrated that rather than ratifying it was that she would come and visit us every Christmas because her birthday was actually Christmas. So I think some part of me balks at the idea of a written contract, but I am entirely willing to say that we should say yes to committing ourselves to being involved in people's life for their whole life that are our friends and not our family. And some beautiful examples of that I see are in godparenthood and involving people. A part of that relationship too with my mom and with Gwenny was that Gwenny never got married. And so it wasn't like because she's not married, she's going to be in our circle at all. But there's that sense of almost a friendship being a more fundamental relationship than just family, that is as fundamental a need, I think, in human connection. And so being willing to kind of have some soft boundaries between friendship and family.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think that's sort of where Elizabeth lands in the piece as well. She spends this time exploring it and just reflecting on these things and the desire to recognize the seriousness of friendships and the value of some friendships. But there's that resistance inside us when it comes to putting things down in a contract, because that has such a business or such a transactional feeling that seems to negate everything that friendship is about. I want to shift a little bit to talking about story and narrative. And you talk in Aggressively Happy about telling ourselves good stories about our lives. So you write, the stories we tell about our days become the stories we tell about our lives. We develop a habit of telling our stories that casts a mood, an ethos, an Instagram filter over how we see our lives and how we invite others to see us. So I'm curious what stories you tell about your friendships, and especially what stories about yourself that your friends have given to you.
Now that you mention it, I talk about Gwenny in that chapter in Aggressively Happy, because I had this experience where my little 2-year-old niece, who's wonderful and precocious, and I got to stay with him for 3 weeks while my sister had COVID, and kind of care for her. And I noticed how much she loved being told stories, and she particularly loved being told stories about herself. So I could get her to sit still and be quiet for 20 minutes at a time if I told her a Lillian story. And what's fun is that I know that my mom did that to me too. She would tell me Joy stories. And so it's kind of a carrying on of the tradition. But it just struck me as this very living example of that, of how much Lillian loved to be told stories and how kind of she ate that up. Was that one day she took a picture off of my sister's fridge and took it to her, and she said, "Mama, who's this?" And it was a picture of my Auntie Gwenny, this very dear friend of my mom. And my sister went, that's Gwenny. We love her. She's one of the good ones. She said, she's one of our people. And I had this kind of realization of, this is storytelling come to life. This is Lillian loves to know stories about herself, particularly loves to know stories about everybody in her world. And Sarah is telling Gwenny into her story and including her and narrating her as this good and loving person. That was a beautiful thing. And what it revealed to me was kind of the fact that, and I'm just expanding on what you said, but the fact that how we tell a story about a person shapes how we relate to them. That Lillian was prepared to think of Gwenny as someone who is loving, is goodwill towards her, is like her. And I think that when we think about the people in our lives, I was actually just talking with a friend this weekend who moved radically from one context to another. And in the first context, everyone narrated her as, she had some really difficult things happen in her life, but they narrated her as troubled, as difficult, as all these things. Then when she was in a different context, she just wasn't narrated that way anymore. And there was this kind of this burden that was lifted off of her. And she was able to think, oh, I'm not a difficult person. I've experienced great challenges. I'm not an insane or a neurotic person. I'm a person who has experienced difficult things and is working out what that looks like to live well. And I think that that's a great example of the fact that we get into habits of telling stories about each other and about people in our communities that could really tangibly affect what they think is possible for themselves, and what we think is possible for them and how we should relate to them. If you're telling the story of someone as a neurotic, difficult person, you will always relate to them in that way. And that doesn't mean that some people aren't neurotic and difficult, but I think that for me personally, one of the gifts of friendship is that it can help correct the stories that I have told about myself when they're not good stories. So I think one of my besetting sins is this weird combination of like self-hatred mixed with pride, where I'm like so confident of my ability to do everything perfectly that I then hate myself for not doing things perfectly. And so I then narrate myself as like, doing a bad job and being a failure, not working hard enough. And I'll never forget one time talking with my friends, and I was like, I just think I'm really lazy. And one of my friends looked at me and was like, what is wrong with you? Like, that's insane. You do too much all the time and you exhaust yourself, and then you beat yourself up for being exhausted. And it's a silly thing, but just having someone narrate that back to me freed me from my own just like frankly delusional story about myself and help me reevaluate what's actually happening. And I think that that's such an important part of friendship, is that we're all unreliable narrators about our own lives. We are all walking around with a log in our own eye. And a part of friendship is just the kind of grace of people being able to see you better than you can see yourself and help you get out of those silly cycles of how you tell your own story. And doing that, help you imagine other possibilities about how to live life.
Yeah, that's such a gift with friendship. I recently saw Malcolm Guite and Steve Bell talking about their friendship. And their friendship has partly been mediated by this creative collaboration that they enjoy together. But they spoke of it so beautifully. They spoke of that collaboration and of their friendship as giving each other back to each other. So each felt that the other person had given their own self back to them in a way that made them see themselves in a really beautiful way. The other person in the friendship told their story in a really beautiful way. It's such a key part of friendship, and we often don't realize that we're doing this when we interact with our friends, but how we talk to our friends and how we talk about our friends can help sort of shape the possibility that they see for their own lives, in really destructive and harmful ways, or in really beautiful and life-giving ways. I'm curious if there are particular people in your life who have modeled friendship well for you. You talk a bit in Aggressively Happy about emptying yourself or giving yourself away, and an emptying that isn't sort of emptying yourself out, but emptying into other people and into other things. So I'm curious if there are people that you look to where you say, I'd like to be like them. I'd like to be a friend like they are.
Yeah, there are. Of course I could speak at length about like my mom or various people, but I think the person who came to mind is a woman named Phyllis, and she is now I think she must be in her late 80s now. And she was a mentor to my mom, but then she was a mentor to me. And she just saw it as her role to kind of mentor and befriend young women and walk with them in the faith through life. And so from the time I was in high school, she had Bible studies and I would be in them, but she would, every once in a while, she would just have me over one-on-one. And when I would come over, she would have laid out some small treat and, something special, whether it was berries because it was summer and they were fresh or whatever, and have a beautiful little set of teacups laid out. It was never terribly long, but for those 45 minutes, I was all that mattered in Phyllis's world. And the thing is that I know that she invested in hundreds of friendships in that way. You know, I mean, she is a skilled friend. But what was so generous about her was that I knew that she cared about every single one of them. And I think, you know, I see her less frequently because have been able to be back to Colorado as much. But there's just this quiet, continued attention and care and delight in me and in my life and in existing. And I think she has this just kind of this eye for delight in other people, to delight in what God is doing in other people, and to see friendship with them and investing in them as this kind of capacity to witness. And I think she's really modeled to me how to make people feel loved. That, you know, that maintaining a friendship can be as simple as a 45-minute tea, but that you make that a meaningful time. You prepare for people, you see them, you delight in them. And then thinking of friendship and of investing in friendship as the honor of getting to witness another person's life. And she's just been so faithful, so sweet, and such a gift in my life that I want to model that in other people's lives, you know, to make room for other people, to make people feel special and remembered. Whenever I think of her, I always think of when Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you. And I think in our rootless world, one of the things we want most is to know that someone has made a place for us, you know, and whether that's berries in the summertime or having put on crisp sheets when a friend comes and visits, I want to model that she has been someone who made a place for people and that kind of delighted in witnessing their life and did that in this really consistent, faithful way that had a great longevity about it.
That's beautiful. I want to end with just one last question about grief. And for those who haven't read your book, Aggressively Happy, they might be surprised to know that it actually talks quite a lot about grief and sadness and choosing to find joy sort of in the midst of all of life's turmoil. And I've talked with lots of people about their experience of friendship, particularly people who have moved. I've moved across Canada a number of times, and I have a number of friends who have also moved either across the country or internationally, and they feel this deep sense of grief at the physical distance between them and their friends. And I'm curious if you have any advice for those who feel overwhelmed by the weight of grief at the distance that can separate us from our loved ones. What would you say to offer them hope?
The first thing I would say is just to make room for that grief, to not try to feel like you need to justify it or rush through it or, you know, all those things. I think grief will make herself known. And so better to welcome her in than to kind of keep her at bay. I talk in the book about befriending sadness. I think part of the reason we're afraid to grieve, at least part of the reason I have been afraid to grieve, is because I'm always afraid that if I kind of sit down with that feeling, all I'll discover is kind of a permanent impermanence. You know, I'll discover that everything can run away from me, that it can be lost, and that life is just one long process of losing one thing after another. And so there's that fear of sitting with grief and realizing that this is really what life is. Life is loss and aloneness. And if that's the case, it really is an enemy to happiness, right? It's if it's going to tell you the truth and the truth is quite bleak, then why would we want to sit with sadness? But I think what I would encourage people to know is that grief is a testament to value and to love. You know, the fact that we grieve means that there was something substantial and worth grieving. And in a weird way, grieving is a way of staying in touch with that goodness. You know, it's being unwilling to say, no, that connection didn't really matter. It's grieving is saying, no, it really did matter. And I really do want it. And that rootedness is something worth desiring. And to know that is also to know that it's possible and that aloneness is not fundamental, because when you recognize that value and that you're kind of bearing witness to its reality. So I think those are some of the things I would say is make room for grief. Don't be afraid of grief or suspicious of it. It doesn't testify to utter darkness. It actually testifies to meaning and to weightiness and to value. the final thing I would say is to just rest in the fact that no feeling is final, no feeling is permanent, and that you may be surprised yet by what good things are coming, by what reunions might happen, by what new gifts might be given to you. I start aggressively happy by talking about kind of a period of intense grief and a time when I just felt like I just felt like what good can come after this? What new doors can open? And, it may sound like an old and tired motto, but good things are still on the horizon, things you can't even imagine yet. So hold on, befriend sadness. Don't be afraid of it. Recognize what good things it testifies to. But then also, be ready for good things that are still in the world. There are still many blessed things that you haven't gotten to experience that are waiting for you. And if you can't believe it right now, I do. And trust that those things, they will come eventually.
I think that's a lovely note to end on. Joy, it's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Whole Person Revolution podcast, which is as much a cultural compass for comment as it is an incarnate witness of the hope we explore in our pages. Like what you heard? Check out this podcast's intellectual seedbed at www.comment.org, where you'll find an artistic rendering of essays that shed light on the very real shadows afflicting the peace of our commons today, but also the many cracks of light. And consider joining us. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood, or you can suggest questions that are pressing upon your desire to be an agent of grace and truth and gentleness and trustworthiness. We want to hear from you, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at comment@cardis.ca and expect a sincere exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment Magazine, produced and with original music by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you next week.